Welcome to It's All Your Fault on True Story FM, the one and only podcast dedicated to helping you identify and deal with the most challenging human interactions, those involving someone with a high conflict personality. I'm Megan Hunter, and I'm here with my co-host, Bill Eddy.
Hi, everybody.
We are the co-founders of the High Conflict Institute in San Diego, California, where we focus on training, consulting, coaching, classes, and educational programs and methods, all to do with high conflict. Now, today is the fifth of our 5 Types of People Who Can Ruin Your Life series, and this one is specifically focused on domestic violence. And we're really pleased today to be joined by someone who has seen this up close and in person, Nick Hartbauer, who comes to us from Colorado, and I'll introduce him in a moment. But he's going to give us his perspective from the law enforcement side of things and domestic calls. But before we start, please send your questions to podcast@highconflictinstitute.com or through our website at highconflictinstitute.com/podcast, where you'll also find all the show notes and links. So today, this is really going to be a fascinating discussion, and one that I've been looking forward to for quite some time. In this 5 Types of People Who Can Ruin Your Life series, we started talking about antisocial high conflict people and borderline high conflict people. And then in the last episode, we talked about the involvement by some with those high conflict personality types. And mind you, I'd said some, not all, and domestic violence. So who is it that sees domestic violence up close and in person, in real time, and feels it, experiences the fear, I don't know, I haven't been there, but we do have someone who has, and it's law enforcement. So today I'm pleased to introduce Nick Hartbauer. Nick has been in law enforcement for 16 years and currently resides in Colorado Springs, Colorado, here in the U.S. And roughly half that time in law enforcement, Nick has been a patrol officer, and the other half of the time he spent in specialized units such as SWAT, working undercover as a narcotics detective, and various property detective units. The last few years he spent as a patrol officer focusing on victims' crimes, especially concerning domestic violence crimes. So, welcome, Nick. I am really pleased to have you here. Yeah, thank you. Anything we should add to that introduction?
Oh, there's probably lots of little tidbits you could put in there, but that sounds good.
Awesome. Do you have any hobbies?
Hunting, hiking, and whatever my kid does. Like right now is swimming and soccer. So.
Oh, nice. Absolutely. Well, it's nice to have a little bit of a bright spot like that, thinking about kids or something happy we do, because this is a tough topic. This is a really challenging topic. And so if you don't mind, I think it would be interesting to hear about what a typical domestic violence call is like from the law enforcement perspective. Walk us through an example. Let's start with a low risk or low level. I guess those are my words. I don't know what you would call it. DV call. And then we'll follow it up with more of a high risk DV call.
Yeah, I would say an example of like a low risk or low level is exactly the terminology we would use as well. Domestic violence for us in our area is going to be an intimate partner relationship, because some areas domestic violence is concerning all family. But for us, it's just intimate partners. So a low risk call would be like a protection order violation that's done over the phone or by the use of pictures over social media. And there is a no contact, violation from the protection order, and we would go to a alleged victim's residence or work or wherever they are and kind of take their statement and go from there. That usually would mean that the suspect isn't on scene, as far as a low risk goes.
Okay, so you arrive, and what's your heart rate doing when you arrive?
Oh, it's pretty even keel, especially if you know going into it. A lot of times we'll call ahead to let the people know we're coming, because it could be, if it's low risk, it could be a couple hours later that we're responding to the call. So we're going to make sure they're in the same location that they called us from. and they would usually give us an indication if anything, any threats or anything were going to be there, if the suspect was going to be on scene. So it's pretty low level heart rate.
Okay. And then let's switch to that high risk. What's that look like?
High risk is when you have someone calling in 911 frantic, that their partner has, a weapon, a gun or a knife, and they're threatening them, or they're suicidal, but they have a weapon in the house. There's kids in the house, and we're going there to try to, separate threat from, the perceived victims that are there. So we're going in there with a much higher heart rate, and we're trying to assess the scene when we get there and kind of, de-escalate whatever violent activity is going on.
Do you always go in pairs? Do you always have a partner on domestic calls?
Yes, that is typically protocols that we will go. 2 people will be sent, because you never know. Even if they're saying that the suspect's not there, they might show up by the time we get there.
That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. So you're there, and I'm sure over time or beforehand, you get some pretty decent training on what to do in domestic calls.
Yes. And really, you get training through the academy, but in reality, the real training is doing it for the first time when you're a rookie and you come out with your trainer and you go to your first domestic violence call is really where your training starts.
Yeah. So at some point a few years back, I believe, you learned about high conflict people and began to recognize them in your work as an officer, and more specifically in these intimate partner calls. Do I have that right? Or
yes.
Yeah. So tell us about that. Help us learn about your journey.
Yeah, a few years ago, actually about 5 years ago, a couple of Bill Eddy's books were recommended to me. This and Splitting were the first 2 books that I read, and then that evolved into, I'm starting to see this on calls for service, and the behavioral patterns are exactly the same, and actually exactly the same every single time. And I don't want to say it's 100% of the time, but almost every single domestic violence call I went to, you had a high conflict person there, and they displayed all those behavioral patterns that you talk about in your books. And then once I started to see that, I wanted to study it more. So I found all your guys' books and the High Conflict Institute and started taking trainings from that. And it helped, more and more with that. And then that kind of developed into a passion of me wanting to dive into, victim crimes more, because taking your guys' theory and applying it to domestic violence calls helped victims so much to recognize the situation they were in. And I was able to teach them what you taught me.
What was different that you taught them once you learned about the personalities? Like that they won't change, or that because that's to me one of the biggest differences of personality disorders and high conflict personalities is it's a more fixed pattern, less susceptible to change than 90% of people.
Yes, that's huge. That's a huge point that I try to get across to people, and is that they're not going to change, because most victims are very much fixers, and they're like, well, I can do it. I have all this hope in the world that I'm just going to stick it out. I'm strong enough to fix them. And getting people to understand that there isn't any fixing is very empowering. And it's like, okay, now that I know I can't fix them, I can actually just move on and be okay with that fact. And I feel like I had a lot of people that would leave the relationship like that day or very soon after, just with a hour or 2 conversation with them, explaining to them everything that I learned from you guys about what a high conflict person is, explaining that to them. And a lot of times victims don't like to talk, or they like to guard the suspect, and letting them know what they're dealing with before they tell you what they're dealing with is huge, because they're like, how did you know that? Like it's like you see the future, you see the past, or, and I'm like, well, it kind of is in a sense. And once they understand it, they kind of see that they need to leave.
That's really interesting. I hadn't pictured how you would approach people, especially victims, this way. And the predictability. So you tell them what they're probably experiencing because they don't want to tell you. That's really huge. I don't know how many other law enforcement officers have this background, but I think that's probably just a tremendous help to victims to understand what's going on.
Yes. And on that point, I don't think very many law enforcement officers do. And I started to notice that, more and more, and just started to see the overwhelming need that in law enforcement for us to really understand the high conflict person theory and how much it helps within law enforcement and how much it helps victims.
Yeah, it is really fascinating. I mean, what a huge investment in society, truly. Because like you said, so many victims will defend their abuser and not tell the truth. It's kind of scary. And the thought of losing that relationship is tough. And you said the phrase, they have all this hope. And the words that ring in my ears are from Dr. Phil of 20 years ago. I didn't hear him say this, but my mother-in-law she loved to put things on sticky notes and leave them on doors all over her house, little sayings. And the sticky note on the door to the guest bedroom where we always stayed said, "Hope is not a plan." And that just really rings true here, right? You can be hopeful all you want, but you got to have a plan. You got to get moving on. Okay, so when you arrive on scene, so we've already talked about kind of the aftermath, right? Let's say someone's been cuffed and they're in the car headed to the station or whatever, right? Then you talk to the victim. What do you notice when you arrive? You knock on the door, somebody comes to the door. How do you see or apply that high conflict personality theory in that moment?
I believe a lot of times when we are called to a scene, I think a higher percentage of the time, the suspect is kind of calling in on themselves is what I kind of call it, and saying that they're a victim of something. And then a lot of times, I'll get there and they are just trying to get the actual victim in trouble for something. So what I'm looking for right away is call screen notes can show it too, but the unmanaged emotion can almost be seen before getting there. Just by the quotes of whatever the caller's saying. But even there's been times where I've called people ahead of time, like, "Hey, I'll be there in 2 minutes." They're alone, and I show up and I get there and people open the door and like, "Oh my God, like you scared me." I'm like, "I don't know why I scared you. I literally just told you I was about to show up to your door, and not that it's like a always type, scenario where I'm seeing the behavioral patterns right away, but it's like an indicator, hey, this might be some unmanaged, emotion, or they're just trying to fake being the victim a little bit too much.
Yeah, I'm picturing that. So how do you figure out, like, what's your structure? Like, you come to the house, they're both there. Do the two of you put them in separate rooms? And what do you do with the suspect? You talked about the victim having a conversation with the victim. What do you do with the suspect? And how do you assess that this is really the abuser or the victim? How do you kind of sort that out?
Yeah, typically, even when they're both there, you can kind of call it a low risk at times where they're both kind of calm. When you get there, you might have one displaying a little bit of unmanaged emotion right away, or sometimes and maybe it's more antisocial where they kind of don't really show any emotion, like they're not worried because they know they're about to manipulate you. So it just seems like they're kind of so cool and calm. But anyway, so I like that initial couple of minutes when they're both in the same room and not, my partner might be talking to one, I might be talking to the other, to see which one wants to overhear the conversation more. Because they're trying to see what they're saying to shout over them. You're like, "Hey, well, this happened today," or "He hit me," and then the other person's not really talking to my partner. He's really more listening to the conversation, and they're like, and then they shout out like, "I didn't hit her, him, or whatever. They did it to me." And then once I kind of see that, it really kind of speaks to, okay, I have the victim here, or I have the suspect here, and now I'm going to separate and go into another room, because separating is huge, because as much as victims don't want to talk or make the other person look bad, they definitely aren't going to tell you anything in front of the other person. At least not, in a high percentage of the time they won't. So you got to get them to where they feel comfortable to speak, where the other person can't hear.
And then when you're listening to their stories, are you listening for, all or nothing, for blame, for taking responsibility, for manipulation, for lies?
Yes, all the above. So I would say with victims, what you see more is you'll see the real like tremors, or like the real like shaking, where they're, if they're kind of scared to even talk to you, because they're scared of the repercussions afterwards. Even if it's just verbal, abuse, there's been nothing physical, but there's so much verbal that they're worried about when you leave, that verbal is just going to escalate and they're going to have to deal with this hostile environment. So they're scared about what they say to you when they're there. So they kind of tremor, but it's very noticeable and it doesn't stop because it's uncontrollable. On the other hand, I'll see suspects try to fake that. Sometimes they try to fake tremors, and they do it like too much, like with their hands are like really shaking, but then they stop, and then it starts up again and it stops. And then with victims, they won't tell you a whole bunch of detail. You have to pry all of that out, and really, I really try to start with, this is probably what you're dealing with. You're probably walking on eggshells all the time. You're probably being abused all the time. With suspects, you just say what happened, and for 10 minutes, you don't say anything. And they just tell you every terrible, bad thing this person's ever done in their life, and the all or nothing. There's
the blame and the all or nothing. It's so 100% the other person's fault, and I'm clean. I have no responsibility in this, right?
Yes.
Interesting.
What percent of them lie to you? In other words, if you're on a call, is it like 90% one of them's going to be lying to you? Or is that less than half, and they both kind of talk about what really happened?
That's a good question. I don't want to say, I don't want all or nothing thinking on my own part, but I don't want to say the suspect 100% of the time is going to lie to you. I think a lot of times they believe their own intrusive ideations about their perceptions, or they're putting their past victimization into the current situation. So it kind of seems real, and it seems truthful, but there definitely is mixed in unrealistic or illogical kind of explanations from the suspect. With the victim, as far as them lying, I think that I started to get past that quickly by almost immediately every time saying, I know what you're going through, and explaining that, because that was huge. To be like, I know you're experiencing this. I believe you. You're empowered now. And that was, and they're like, holy crap, how do you know that? You definitely are going to believe me. No one's ever told me this before. Even my own family doesn't believe, me, but you're saying you already know what I'm going through, and I haven't even told you anything. I think that's really huge. And then you might get it a little bit. They might downplay some stuff, but once they feel believed, even if you're like, well, is it really, that trivial, or is it, a little bit more, egregious? And then they're like, well, you might be right. It might be escalated to this or whatever. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah. No, that's good.
Well, I just want to take a quick break, and then we'll be back and we'll continue our really interesting conversation with Nick Hartbauer. All right. And we are back to continue talking about domestic violence, intimate partner violence. Bill, do you have another question?
Yeah. So the lying person who's faking tremors, who says, oh, she did it to me, that kind of thing, seems kind of like the antisocial personality, whether they have that personality or just traits of that, but it's kind of that theme. I wonder if you see the other theme that we hear about a lot, and that's the person that's crying and said, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done it. I know I hit her. I didn't mean to. Do you get that where the person like admits it and is sorry and sad, or is that pretty rare?
I would say it's definitely more rare. But sometimes when you call them out, showing with the ear statements, empathy, attention, and respect, when you call them out in a respectful manner and show that you're going to give the attention for them to explain why, and the respect of like, hey, you're human, they will sometimes, but it is more rare, will it be like, yeah, okay, you're right, I screwed up.
So more often it's the denial and it's all the other person's fault.
Yeah, and they will generally hold true to, not being the one that did anything all the way through the whole process.
Mm-hmm. Do you have to arrest somebody? I know for a period of time that officers had to pick who they were going to arrest, but they had to leave with someone arrested. Is that still true, or have you had to do that?
If there is probable cause, so if there is a law broken, yes, we have to. But there's a misconception. Like if we show up for arresting somebody, that's not always the case. But generally, if we show up, we are in a situation where there's a high conflict person and a victim, whether or not there's PC or not. So even if there isn't PC on that day,
PC being probable cause.
Yes, sorry. Probable cause, law's been broken, so I now have to arrest somebody. If I don't see any of that, there likely has been at some point. But so that's generally where I will, again, take the victim aside. This is, probably not the first time this has happened. This probably happens, more days out of the month than not. And, they'll usually agree. And a lot of times I'll ask to see their cell phone. That's actually a pretty huge thing I do in investigations, because almost all the time victims will give me their password and let me look whatever I want in their phone. They're like, there's all of it. And a lot of times I will get PC or probable cause in the text message communication.
What's that look like, Nick? What's PC in one of those?
Calling people names is the biggest one, over and over consistently. Just constant, just barrages.
Like you, C-word, or you.
Everything. Yeah. All the ones that are going to get the other person to be so defensive that they cause conflict back. So I'm looking for victim statements. I see, because there's victims that are emotionally immature, so their defensive statements back can almost seem high conflict, but you can see the defensiveness to it because you can see where it was started and that they were drawn into the conflict. And usually when that happens, there's paragraph after paragraph of conversation, because that high conflict person is now like, yes, I got you. And they're just going at the conflict over and over. And that's generally where you see some like the harassing type messages.
So is name calling illegal?
It can be, especially if it's repeated or depending on, what time it is at inconvenient hours, person's at work, or if it's 2:00 in the morning. Plus, with text messages, you also see there's 27 phone calls within a minute and a half period, and they're just not, responding, and they keep saying over text message, stop calling me, stop calling me, stop calling me. And the person keeps going.
So that's harassment then. That's a crime. Okay. Do you have many with a woman as a perpetrator?
Yes.
What % would you say from your experience?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's something that I started to question because I looked into a National Institute of Justice study. In that study, it showed about like 84 to 97% of males were the suspect and were the ones arrested within all police departments over the nation, but it specified the specific ones within the study. And I was seeing that, although I believe that males are more often the suspect, I think it's probably closer to a 60% male to 40% female suspect. And I think that kind of correlates from, hearing your guys' numbers and your guys' books and trainings and stuff like that. And just roughly the hypothesis being like, I think it's probably somewhat close to that, which would mean, which I started to see that there's probably 20 to 25% of people that are arrested in domestic violence every day in every law enforcement agency all over the nation that are probably being falsely arrested.
What percent? 20?
I would think it's somewhere around 20 or 25% based off of that study. And kind of, I think the arrest should correlate more to what percentage of people are high conflict persons or not. I think there's a direct correlation there. And obviously haven't, professionally studied that. But as I've gone through investigations, that's kind of what I've seen, even though I haven't taken my own arrest stats and kind of compared them. But I would think that is what it probably should be.
Well, it's interesting. I just want to say that the big study on the prevalence of personality disorders that was done like 2002 to 2008 came out that borderline personalities about 47% male, 53% female. So almost equal. And we see that borderline pattern in a lot of male domestic violence perpetrators, but antisocial was about 26% female and 74% male. So the prevalence of female borderlines and antisocials is much higher than I think most people think. It's still a minority, and I don't want to say that it's 50-50 and everything's equal, but I think that you're right, that it kind of flies under the radar. And there may be, and I've had cases as a lawyer like this with male clients where they were accused of being the perpetrator when in fact the female was in fact the one who had been violent and with a history of that. So it's interesting. I think people should know that, but also not say, well, men are just as abused as women, because that's not true. It's still more of a male thing.
Yes, I think so.
What about children? So if there's children in the household, how do you deal with that? What do the children generally seem like? And how do you deal with that if you have to send away one of the parents?
Depending on the age of the children, I may or may not talk with them. I will try to arm the victim parent with the best knowledge that they can give the children. I would say when children are involved, I try to really let the victim know the amount of emotional damage is being caused to the kids and how it's not about them. It's more about the kids, and getting out of that situation like as soon as possible is only going to help the children's, emotional state. Like almost immediately, once, because they're experiencing the same, they walk on the same eggshells that the victim does, and there's no safe place. If the victim doesn't feel safe, then the children aren't really feeling safe, and they're constantly, just being, withdrawn, from conversation or whatever, because their emotional state is kind of a survival and just, I don't want to say anything because, dad or mom's going to, come after me if I say anything. So, but there is times where I will speak to the children, about what's occurring, but I really try to leave that up to the victim parent to kind of, I many times will give them your guys' material or suggest to them multiple different books, depending on what their situation is. I suggest, different books, but I usually give them a whole bunch of, and then I give them your guys' website and everything. And if I'm not able to get across to people exactly, in the couple hours I spend with them, once they, read one of your guys' books, they almost immediately will reach out like, thank you so much. I can't believe I didn't read this, before. I completely understand now. I've moved out, I'm living with my parents, or I got a place or whatever. And at least, in the meantime, that's, kind of calms everything down. The kids can feel calm and they feel calm. Even if there's not kids involved, you can kind of separate and then kind of see what goes on. And sometimes the domestic violence continues, especially in stalking cases.
Yeah, and that's one of the questions I wanted to ask. But I had one comment about the children, and that's that if you as the parent, whether you're male or female, show your kids that this isn't okay, right? You show them that they deserve to be protected. right? That's what you're really teaching them is I deserve to be protected. And if you stay in that situation long term, I think children begin to develop a belief that they don't deserve to be protected. And then what does that say when they reach adulthood? What kind of relationships are they going to get in, right? Are they going to repeat the cycle because they think they deserve it? They're used to it? I don't know. Just my thoughts. So let's talk about two things here, stalking, and then we're going to talk about orders of protection. So how common is stalking?
I'd say it's a lot more common than people think, especially we see it, quite a bit. Even sometimes it's someone will continue stalking even if they know police are seeing their stalking patterns because they think they're just going to be better next time and be smarter than you and they're going to get away with it the next time. But sometimes when people are kind of stalking, they're trying to continue that manipulation process of talking the victim in one last time, to coming back to repeating the cycle. And if law enforcement intervenes once or twice, they kind of get the hint and go away.
And that might be the person who fears abandonment.
Yes.
Right? So they feel like they have to be connected. And it doesn't seem unusual to them that they are driving past the other person's house 42 times a week, right? Or sending all those emails or, monitoring phones, things like that, right?
Yes. And I think that's where, the cars method and the ears method really help. If you're able to try to have some of that compassion for the suspects, knowing that they probably had some type of childhood trauma that caused this, especially that's why I studied your guys' stuff even more to once I understood those methods more and developing more of that, passion, empathy for the suspects. So you're really able to apply the ear statements very
effectively, probably.
Very effectively. And they kind of, if you kind of like, hey, you can't do this because I understand that you missed this person or whatever, but it's just not working, or however you explain that, and you kind of explain it with empathy instead of aggression. And a lot of times, but not always, they will, they seem to kind of get it a little bit more, and they, in some cases, will thank you, but you definitely don't get that all the time.
That's great.
Yeah. So then let's go to the more extreme stalking cases. What do those look like? Maybe with someone that is, needs to dominate that antisocial. That to me seems scarier.
Yes. Like cases where people have, moved to Colorado to get away from someone in another state, and that person is driving or never been to Colorado, but they are now have a rental property in Colorado. The suspect does, and they are staying there every so often just to stalk the other person, or they're good with computers and they're good with quasi hacking, or they're good hackers or something like that. And then we have to get in touch with some. I've been able to get in touch with some like nonprofit cybersecurity people that will do stuff, will help the victims for free in that in those type of situations to scrub all those stuff from the internet, and as well as the victim advocacy programs where they can hide their identity, their address, and stuff like that. Those are definitely more of the extreme, or the suspect, they either remain pretty silent, think they're being very crafty, but then you have the like more overt ones that will just tell us to our face, I don't care what you do, I'm going to continue to come after this person and screw you guys, and et cetera. And they're just like, they're going to keep stalking this person. They know we're involved, and they have no care in the world. And that's generally where it's like, this could be very dangerous. You really need to, especially if they have the financial means or their family does, it's like, you need to like move like today. And a lot of times I'll even call family members and be like, hey, can I talk to your mom or dad or your sister or whoever is around, and explain the situation to them so they can be like, oh crap, okay, this is serious.
That's incredible, Nick. That's man, that's big. That's huge.
And they're lucky.
Yeah.
They're lucky to have you with your background knowledge and investment in helping people manage and get away from the situation. Because I think a lot of people just don't have that kind of background. Yeah.
And once I started to understand intrusive ideations and how those can, like gaslighting in the true sense of the definition, how people display those kind of behaviors, they project those behaviors where they'll call in, they'll falsely report someone's doing something, but that's because they're thinking about doing it, whether it's parental kidnapping or other violent stuff. And you start to see that pattern more, and then you can start to go, this is actually, pretty dangerous. And not noticing that trend with, other officers and even some of our domestic violence, detectives and stuff like that aren't really, I don't see that they really understand that. So that the need for the high conflict theory to be taught in law enforcement, I think is overwhelmingly huge. It needs to start happening.
Interesting. So let's talk about restraining orders or orders of protection and no contact, I guess. What I would imagine with the low risk, they probably work. Are there cases where they don't work?
Yeah, it's just a piece of paper that someone signs, so it's not actually going to keep the person that wants to stalk or wants to have communication with the victim from doing that. And I also see a lot that the suspects are claiming to be the victim, and they'll make up something to get a restraining order on the victim, and then they'll try, even though there's a no contact, the suspect that got the restraining order will call the victim to them saying everything's going to be fine, and then they'll kind of trap them into getting arrested so they can feel like the victim. But it's hard to say that they really work very much. Where usually we don't see that in law enforcement where they work, because we're not getting called, because if they work, then the person's not calling us because they worked. So I don't even know what that percentage really looks like.
So in a situation like that, let's say someone has a restraining order and, harassment continues, the, controlling behavior, or, stalking. What do you recommend? What should a person do? Let's say it's someone who's, has young kids, not a lot of financial means, family's a long way away. Move
with family a long ways away. If you have family that's willing, and even if they're across the nation or whatever, at least in the short term, you need to make that extreme decision for yourself and your kids to be safe, and try and don't let the suspect know, where you're at. In some cases, they can pull on your heartstrings. I just want to talk to my kid. I want to FaceTime my kid just to see where you're at. They don't even really want to talk with the kids or whatever. So it's really kind of hard to say do or don't talk with the other parent at all until there's some type of something from the court, because suspects can take that to mean I can alienate, the victim. But with victims in that situation, if you have any means to move with family somewhere where you are protected and more safe, and you got a witness, their friends, whatever, without telling the suspect where you're going or trying to hide that, or getting into some type of victim program where they help hide your address and online identity, you have to start making those calls today. If you don't have any help, you're going to do it yourself, ask friends or family for help, or hopefully if you call someone in law enforcement, they're understanding and they believe what you're going through, and they can help get those resources to you. Lots of DV shelters and nonprofit organizations, and there's a lot of help. So make the call, right? All right. Well, I think we've gone almost 45 minutes, and I think we could go probably several hours on this, and we'll most definitely have you back, Nick. Any last questions, Bill?
I don't know how long a question this is, but I'm wondering if you know any outcomes, for the suspects or the victims. What do you hear back later, 6 months or a year later, how things turn out, or you pretty much don't know after you've dealt with them directly? I do hear back quite a bit, 6 months, a year, even more, from people, whether they're just thanking me for getting them out of that situation and they're glad they're out, or maybe they reached out in the days or weeks to follow, and then a few months goes by and I just kind of I wonder how that, if that person's doing, if they're still getting contacted, or if they're, they're still in their good state of mind, their kids are in a good state of mind. I'll just reach out and ask them how they're doing. And then a lot of times that'll initiate a huge conversation. But yeah, there is a lot of really awesome success stories that I've heard.
from that. So,
and victims, suspects, do they get into treatment programs? Do they end up in prison? Do you ever hear what the, I don't know if I should use this word, what the hope is for them in society?
I don't typically hear of suspects, becoming better.
They're not calling you and saying, "Hey, thanks, Nick."
No, I don't think ever.
Yeah.
Actually, just from hearing from other, victims, I don't know if I've really ever heard like, hey, the person's made a change in their life and we're able to get along now. Yeah, I think it's very rare for, I know there's been a couple cases where there's been court-ordered psychiatric, help for suspects and stuff like that. But a lot of times they don't go, or they just stop contact completely with their kids, or they're like, screw it, I don't want to go to that. I'll just not even talk to my kids, and they just kind of go away.
Yeah, in family court, we've had cases that were ordered into 52-week batterers group therapy that have been helpful. But like you said, it's not a lot. So just people know listening, there are resources, but getting people who are abusers to use them is a big project and often takes a court order. Yes,
and I've tried a couple times to experiment myself to try to see if I can talk some sense into suspects in the short time I have with them, and it's their reasoning and logic are just so out there that it's like it seems impossible for them to even understand.
That's what Bill would call a forget about it.
Yeah.
You were going to go there, huh, Bill?
Exactly what I was going to say. Thank you, Megan, for saying it.
I had to learn that the hard way.
Yeah, but you learned it. That's the important thing. So one last question, then we'll go. I know there's a lot of trackers that can be put on cars and personal items and things these days. How does someone figure that out? How do you know? How do you check out your car, your items? Find out if you're being tracked.
I get that a lot. And it used to be like we would just call people crazy that, in law enforcement, it was just kind of overwhelming. Someone says they're being tracked, or like, oh, that person's crazy. Well, these days, like there is so many trackers, and there's so many OBD sensor things that you can put either in your car, that there's programs out there. You can track the health of your car, but it also is doing GPS. Or there's car companies, especially more expensive cars that have constant tracking that you can sign up for, on their website or whatever. So it is very prevalent, people's phones can be tracked. And then you have like the hair tags. We see a lot of people sew into backpacks or shoes, or they place under seats.
It's even I found some luggage with a tracker, because I was thinking, yes, boy, wouldn't it be nice to track your luggage on a flight when it gets lost? But the implications of that in violence are pretty big.
Yeah, I think it's becoming more and more prevalent, especially in like stalking cases, tracking stuff of their kids so they know exactly where the other person's going. And there's RFI detectors, and there's a lot of stuff that you can get on, especially if you look up like spygadgets.com, or I don't even know if that's an actual website, but you can Google like spy gadgets or stuff to detect trackers. And there's some inexpensive, options that people can look for. I mean, really just kind of tearing apart your car. If you think there's something's being tracked in your car, and looking under seats, they can make little Pelican magnetic boxes where they can put air tags in and place them in any type of metal under your car. So in wheel wells or on the frame or whatever, checking that, or just taking it to a mechanic and asking them, or hopefully if you ask somebody in law enforcement, they'll actually do that for you.
Okay, very good. So if you're, listening to this and, you're in one of these situations, just be aware of that. We aren't wanting people to be paranoid, but it is just easy and doable, more doable these days. So we want you to be safe. And so, we'll put some links in the show notes about places you might be able to find something like this or more information. I'm sure there's lots out there. So we'll look it up and we'll put it in there. Nick, thank you.
Thank you.
From the bottom of our hearts for being here today. You've been there, done that, and we're grateful. There are people who are being helped listening to this, and it will live on in perpetuity. So thank you. Thank you for the service in law enforcement, first of all, and thank you for being here today.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you for having me.
Oh, you bet.
Thanks so much. Yeah, this is really great. I think this will help a lot of people.
Absolutely. Next week, we'll continue our 5 Types series. Next week, it'll be on narcissistic personality, high conflict personalities, and then we'll follow that up with what that looks like in relation to domestic violence. In the meantime, send your questions to podcast@highconflictinstitute.com or submit them to highconflictinstitute.com/podcast. Until next time, keep learning and practicing skills, be kind to yourself and others while we all try to keep the conflict small and find the missing piece. It's All Your Fault is a production of True Story FM. Engineering by Andy Nelson. Music by Wolf Samuels, John Coggins, and Ziv Moran. Find the show notes, and transcripts at truestory.fm or highconflictinstitute.com/podcast. If your podcast app allows ratings and reviews, please consider doing that for our show.